If you've got involvement,
yeah,
that's good.
Hi, I'm Vibeke from Kontrapro Risk Management, and this is Larsen from Baldwin Global. And today we're going to talk about risk management and specifically the perfect risk meeting. Yeah. So, Alexandra, I challenge you. What is the perfect risk meeting for you?
Well, so the perfect risk meeting, I think, it needs to be broken up into separate stages. Pre-meeting, during meeting and post-meeting. I think all aspects are critical. And if I take pre-meeting, and some of these will overlap, but if we take pre-meeting, I think gathering the right information is very important. Having the right information or enough information so that when you get to the risk meeting itself, you're not spending a whole day trying to identify risk. You have something to start with. Obviously, hopefully you'll still identify new risks or whatever that might be, but certainly having that background information, understanding the context, understanding who's going to be there, and making sure that you know, have the right people coming as well. So if I do look at that first step, gathering the information I think is crucial. We can discuss that in a little bit more detail. But certainly, I mean, there's ways you can do it, whether it's a survey, an online survey, which they can be reasonably valuable. They're not my favorite or go-to approach, but they'll work in some instances. There's also maybe interviews. So as a consultant, I would usually do interviews, go out, but if it's an internal risk meeting you're running, you maybe don't want to do interviews. Just to take a step back as a risk manager and rather than a consultant, one thing I've always found valuable is just wandering around the organization as a risk manager. You shouldn't be sitting at your desk. You should be wandering around, talking to people, having casual conversations and serious conversations about risk. You pick up so much doing that, and that can help towards the meeting itself. You pick up little things that you might be able to take to someone else and say, look, someone was talking about this, how does that fit with the overall risk profile? And
yeah. If I can just add in here, it's not about you as risk manager identifying the risk.
No.
It's about finding enough information to ask the right questions.
Exactly.
And that's, for me, very important, that the risk manager isn't the one challenging the group to have to give a consensus that this is the risk picture or not. It's about facilitating a group to actually identify or assess further any risks you have already. So,
definitely, yeah. No, I completely agree. So, but by going around the organization, talking to people, you can pick up little bits that you can then ask other people, and then that starts formulating ideas in their head, and it gives you something to draw out in meetings. There's even software. I was in Amsterdam a few months ago, and I was talking to a company called Risk ID, and they have an interesting software. What it does is it's pre-meeting. It sends out potentially a list of risks that have already been identified. It also allows other people to access and add their own risks. They can all score the risks as they see it. And it's more of it's not a finalized scoring or anything like that, but what it does allow is when you get to your risk meeting, it means you have information online, you can use it up on the screen, and you're able to actually then, it automatically filters them based on the risks that were furthest from each other in terms of the scoring. So why did someone say this was a 1 times 1, but someone else said it was a 5 by 5? And then you can have a discussion around that until you get to the ones where everyone agrees on. It just helps prioritize, but it also helps people input in the first place. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that's the right approach to use software. It's just one tool that maybe you can use. And there's probably other tools out there. It was just one that I had in my head. I'd also seen a video online that I quite liked. But there's all sorts of tools that you can use. I mean, in your opinion, pre-meeting, what's your view? What's vital?
for me, gathering the right people. I think the simplest thing, meeting culture, establishing an agenda for the meeting and informing the participants of what is this meeting about and why are we doing this, the purpose. And this is what we're going to go through, because you can be at different stages. It can be a risk identification process where you start at scratch.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it can be a risk meeting that you hold on
an update.
And then you want to investigate further. Are we on track with this risk? Do we have any new risks? Is there any development in a negative or positive direction? So it depends on where you are, but informing the participants that this is what we're doing, this is why it's important, and creating this will to attend.
Yes,
almost.
Exactly. Yeah,
and that's basically
and
the
feeling
meeting
part
culture.
Of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think
building the basis for the meeting.
It goes back to, as we've said in nearly every video, is setting the scene or understanding the context. And it's interesting because when we look at ISO 31000, there is context as part of the process. One of the first part of the process is understanding the context.
Context and scope.
Yeah.
So very important.
Yeah.
And I just noted you talked about this tool, the IT tool to prioritize, because it just made me think about one of the things I found hard when I was doing these regular risk meetings in oil and gas. We tended to start with the most serious risks, the red negative risks, so the threats. Often they were kind of health and safety risks. And we always had trouble to getting to the bottom of the list of severity, but also there was little time left to the positive risks. So
that always gets left behind.
And they were kind of, we tended to identify very generic positive risks because we didn't allow time for them. So the idea of starting with the risks that has less consensus and going to the more consensus-based risks afterwards is quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely, because, and that's the other thing, the big red risks, everyone knows them. Like when I was in Iraq, we had security risks and we had political risks, but we know it. We're in Iraq and there's a security situation, but we're also managing it well. We have security contractors, we're managing that. What about the mice that are chewing on wires? That could cause a shutdown of the whole facility because now we have no power. We don't want to lose track of those. And with things like that, people have very different ideas of that. Some people will say that's not a risk, whilst other people will say, no, that is a big risk because in my blast company, we've experienced that. And a lot of the time it comes from when we install the wires, we don't have gloves on and it just leaves a small residue of oil and it attracts the mice and they chew. So a simple control, we use gloves when we install the wires.
And you can prevent this big
massive thing that could cost millions for just a half-day shutdown. But that doesn't get discussed if we're always looking at the top risk, which is what about a big fire on the tank or So I definitely think it's a different approach. It's not necessarily the right approach, but it's an interesting different approach to look at where's the consensus least agreed on and why.
Yeah, for me it's very interesting, at least because I always felt stuck in this. Okay, we start with the most severe risks.
Just on the opportunities, I really liked that you brought that up. In my last job, we had a department that was very proactive on the risk management side, simply because when we ran the risk management workshop, we were a new department and we decided to have a 2-day workshop whereby we will set objectives. And this was thanks very much due to the manager of the department, who was extremely forward thinking. He basically sat back and said, look, we're a new team, we need to formulate our objectives. And he sat back and let the whole group that he had employed decide the objectives. He said, I don't disagree with any of them. You know your jobs better than I know your jobs. I'm here to manage you and make sure you're able to achieve those objectives. So let's use these objectives that we all agree on. Then let's look at the risks. So we ran a risk workshop. It was supposed to be a day. And he loved it so much because he saw that, okay, now our objectives will change based on all the risks that are there. And we actually ran a third day, and it was all about opportunities. We ran what we called the Google Challenge, and we used the sort of Google approach whereby we think of some crazy ideas, we think of some reasonable ideas, opportunities, and then we try to assess those. And actually the crazy ideas, the wild ideas, we took 1 or 2 of them out of maybe 10 or 15, and those were the ones that were actually the most impressive ideas that we tried to move with. It's that idea of how can we improve a process 10 times rather than just by 10%. And that's when you come up with the crazy ideas. And then we ran with the opportunities. So now every time they have a workshop, they always allow time for the opportunities. But you need to see the value of it first. That's the problem.
And you need to master it. And I think because, it's very embedded in us and in our language that risk is something negative. So I find that to be a struggle. Even when I give trainings, people kind of fall back to, I start with saying it's positive and negative, and then they fall back to the negative. And I can hear myself as well falling back to the threats and the scenarios.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah. I mentioned previously in another video about using examples during training. I think 90% of my examples are all positive examples. Rather than negative. Negative 10% just simply to remind everyone, well, this is risk management. But the 90% is just even to keep myself in check, to remind myself, right, focus on the positive side of here. Yeah. Okay. Good. So what about at the meeting itself then? What happens? We've prepared the meeting, we've got the right people, and I think it's important as well when we talk about the right people, is dependent on culture. Some cultures you'll have maybe a director and people don't want to talk when the director is present, or they will look at him first to see if he's nodding his head or shaking his head. And others are complete opposite, whereby they're more than willing to talk in front of their director. So even understanding that right balance. But once we're there, what's your view?
It's about creating atmosphere, creating safety, or creating the willingness to share and to be a little bit crazy, really. And sometimes you have to be a little bit open-minded, a little bit crazy. And it's not necessarily so that you end up with this crazy risk in your register.
Yeah.
You could end up with something very sensible in your register, but just being willing to go to crazy helps testing the waters, so to speak.
Yeah, and it helps bounce ideas and.
Yeah, and it activates the other participants.
Yeah,
as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it should be most of the time it has to be a sort of a controlled, facilitated process, because many groups are they work together more or less in different relations, but they know each other. And you have this group structure established. So you will have the silent one and you will have the active one, and it could very well be that the silent one sits with a lot of gold relating to different risks. So kind of forcing people to actually say what they think about the topic can be useful. A little bit unpleasant, maybe. Yeah.
And this is the role of the facilitator then.
Yes, yeah. So what I have had people do at some times is to actually give them roles.
Okay.
So I say, you're not the director of economics more. You're the director of HSC.
So think from that point of view.
And your partner here, he will be director of economics. And it can be quite fun. Yeah. Because then they have to, it's kind of a group play or a game. Exactly. Yeah, and it brings out a little bit of the crazy, and it challenges them to come with new ideas, and also it gives a little bit of freedom.
Yeah, of
because
course.
Being someone else is easier than being yourself. And we have when you are the owner of a discipline, it you tend to want to protect it, and you tend to want to portray yourself as professional and in control. And when you switch roles, you can can do something else.
That's I've never tried that. I'm going to have to try that because that does sound really interesting. Because I can imagine when you're change roles, not only would you probably go to extremes in terms of this person has these sort of risks or this kind of their views on what their counterpart's job actually is will be quite open. It's
it can turn out to be just silly sometimes, but
again, it gets things started at least, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I've talked about before activating emotions.
Exactly.
I think that activating emotions, even if we want to be rational and we want to be thinking people, emotions play a part, and when we activate them, something new comes up, and there is also more learning.
We're talking about the perfect risk meeting. If I just realized when we were talking there, if I take a step back, why a risk meeting versus a risk survey, for example, or a risk interviews in order to identify risk? What is your main reason for having a risk meeting instead of other?
Yeah, well, I have done risk interviews and no risk meetings.
Okay.
In organizations that weren't really mature on risk, and I did that because I couldn't find a possibility to sell in the concept of risk meeting, so I started with interviews. The backside of that is that I, as a risk manager, sat with the risk register in the end with very, very nice but not very constructive all power over the result, over how the risk register would look in the end.
Yeah.
And that gives one person too much power to define reality. And a risk register will never define reality, but it will often be read as reality.
Exactly, by someone.
So you need to balance that. So interviews kind of leaves, at least if you're one person as I was, or if you're two consultants from the same company. It will kind of tint the end result, and that's the backside of it. What was the other thing you mentioned?
Risk surveys.
Surveys, I think they are too cold. I think I value the discussion, the group process very much. I like that one.
And risk meetings is vital because you do, again, it goes back to engagement, it goes back to bouncing ideas off of each other, but most important, ownership. If you're in a group and someone agrees to own something, not only are they held to account by the rest of the group, but they've also volunteered themselves. Whilst if you do it individually, it's all very away from me, and as you say, oh, I don't own this risk, you own the risk.
You put it in the register.
Yeah, exactly, And I didn't actually say that, and I didn't mean that.
It's not formulated as I would formulate
it. Exactly.
I have one question for you.
Okay.
And it's something that I have a struggle with myself, and it's the concept of consensus. Do we always need consensus?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I always say ideally we get consensus. I think not all the time. I think, yes, we want consensus. That's the ideal.
Yes.
I think we want consensus. It will bring about much better engagement. No one's going to get angry. With consensus, without consensus, and I mean, I think it tends to be only in some cases, maybe 1 or 2 risks out of 15 that you don't gain consensus in. If that's the case, I think it's okay. It could cause some issues, I think, with certain groups, but generally, I think if you can move on from it, or maybe the director does have to make a sort of more senior decision on that, I think it's okay as long as it's not, the whole thing isn't just, One way we could do it, I think we discussed it very briefly previous to our meetings here, was voting technology. If you find a group who struggle to get consensus, it's not my favorite tool, but it's an effective tool in those situations, bringing in voting technology where people can vote anonymously. The answer is there and we move on. Everyone's voted, it's democratic, and we move on. It's not ideal because we haven't gained consensus, but that's one solution, I think. I don't know, what's your views on it?
No, I'm just really thinking out loud because the ideal, as you say, is consensus. And then I find that sometimes consensus is not the right answer.
Right.
So this is why, I tend to be honest with what I struggle with in the risk management topics. But
so when you say it might not be the right answer, so basically the group might say that we think this is the right scoring for this risk, but we know that actually it doesn't feel right.
Or one expert.
Yeah, one
say
expert.
That this is totally
exactly.
wrong or something like that. So I think there might be two solutions when I think out loud now. And that is if the risk meeting or risk identification or risk assessment process is not on the highest level, could be an idea to escalate the risk to a different level and say, these are the disagreements we have in the group, these are the different views. We leave it to you to decide because you are closer to the chosen strategy and the objectives we have. And the other one is, of course, a more traditional one in the report, and then we're on the after the risk meeting.
Yes.
Just be open about decide where it should be in a matrix or a register or how you would.
But clarify that there was some disagreement around this.
Yeah, be clear about that.
Yeah.
So and
I think that's as much as the risk manager can do. We're saying we don't own the risks. Therefore, we can't really try to influence other than be transparent and say this, is the situation. And to be honest, that first option is quite a nice one. I've experienced that in the past where we've had a risk that no one could agree on. Some said it's completely not a risk. Others said it is a risk and it could cause complete disaster. So we actually had to take that separately. We brought it to a separate group and they decided to investigate it by spending money on bringing external people in. Yeah. In the end, it wasn't a risk at all.
No.
So the people that said it wasn't a risk were right. However, the potential that it could have been wrong would have cost much more than the investigation did. And at least now, suddenly with this investigation, everyone can agree with consensus that it's not a risk.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's actually the job of risk management at the end of the day.
So some things you have to dive into more depth
on. So as you said, we moved to post-meeting. What's important there?
I think the communication part, and also ideally you will have appointed some risk owners during your process.
Or hopefully they've appointed themselves.
Even
ideally.
Yes.
Usually it's a head down.
Yeah,
I didn't hear that question. Who wants to own this risk? Oh, nothing to do with me.
You take it.
Or everyone points. Yeah. No, it's not. It's him.
Yeah. No. So first of all, be open with the results. Give everyone access to the results, the report, or if it's just a risk register in the tool, that's kind of live. Let everyone that's involved actually have access to it, at least to a certain level. If you have confidential information, you can lock down some information about the risk, but transparency to the level that's possible is good because that gives people the possibility to own some of the risk. And to let the risk owners do their job in starting to treat the risks that are necessary to treat. More important than a report, for instance.
Yes. So I think it goes back to something that we've talked about several times because it's risk culture we're talking about. And if we look back at the other videos, we've talked about this many times, but leadership. So the output of the risk management meetings, the output, assuming it's going up to leadership, it needs to be used. Leadership actually have to use this data and then of course it has to be communicated back. Because there's no point in identifying risks, assessing risks, holding your hand up to manage risks and then, or become a risk owner and then actually manage the risks, when you see that no one is actually dealing with it, no one is using this data, your valuable time. People are not going to be interested in undertaking risk unless they see it escalating and then coming back down again.
Yes.
And you mentioned it, transparency and communication. It all forms part of the risk culture and why the perfect risk meeting should end with that.
Yeah, and we talk about, and we have talked about previously, integration,
Yes.
which is really, ideally again, every single individual owning their part of
Yeah.
the risk picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and playing in their information and their knowledge about
Yeah.
it. And if you want that, you need to motivate people.
Yeah, definitely.
And people are motivated by progress.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Mm.
And that's all that is. It's progress. Then you see
Yeah.
where it's gone. And from my last point, I know that I've been successful when I'm not asking people for a risk management meeting. When I get a phone call saying, "Oh, we need to run a risk meeting. Can you come and run the workshop for us?" That's when I know, yes, I've done it.
You achieved something.
That's a way you can measure risk management progress in general. That people are actually calling you up because they want to actually have a meeting.
Yeah, or the management group requesting
Exactly.
some kind of report or
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that.
If you've got involvement,
Yeah.
that's good.
I think we'll leave it at that.
Yes, I think
Perfect
so.
risk meeting.
Perfect risk meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.